You're listening to episode 129 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Thupten Lekshe joins us to provide insights and companionable discussion on the potential benefits and challenges to secular Buddhism. There are a lot of discussions online lately about a wide variety of topics, and it seems that, for some reason, very few of them are in the polite tone we use face-to-face. This makes it all the more difficult to have a dialogue, let alone make any kind of progress. We're not seeing each other online as people, and every week we see back-and-forth comments deteriorate into strict adherence to being right, showing the other person is wrong, or worse, backhanded insults, or outright personal attacks. Today we're going to have a conversation where we don't have agreement on all points, and in fact have very divergent points of view. This episode is not about one person being right and another wrong. It is about sharing, about learning, about understanding more about why someone else thinks and feels the way they do. Inevitably, that is going to vary from our own perspective. Today is about open communication and the building of companionable dialogue with new friends. Alongside his work as a clinical psychologist for more than 30 years, Thupten Lekshe has been a student of Tibetan Buddhism. He was ordained as a Buddhist monk in 2000 and now works actively to bring a Western psychological perspective to Buddhist practice and a more spiritual dimension to psychotherapy. Thupten Lekshe specializes in the use of mindfulness practice as an adjunct to evidence-based psychotherapies and in secular approaches to Buddhism. He is trained in the delivery of Cultivation Emotional Balance, a new course for the general public designed by Dr. B. Alan Wallace and Dr. Paul Ekman. CEB mixes contemplative and emotional regulation skills drawn from Western science and mind training practices drawn from Buddhism. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Gidapahar Estate Green Darjeeling tea. And our guest today is Thupten Lekshe, who goes by TL. TL, thank you very much for being here.
Very welcome. I'm glad to have this conversation.
I am as well, and I'm glad you put it that way, because what we're going to be chatting about today is some of our views on secular Buddhism. And TL, you have a talk coming up it's a public talk on secular Buddhism, fact or fiction. And that'll be
yes.
Friday, August 17th.
The talk I'm giving is at a Buddhist centre in far north Australia, in Cairns, which is right up on the sort of northern tip.
Okay, so people in Australia, if you're listening to this, check that out. I think that would be an interesting talk. And part of the discussion that TL and I will be having tonight is just comparing some of our attitudes and expectations and understandings about what a secular Buddhism practice might be, some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages. So, TL, why don't we start by having you share a bit of your background?
Okay, I became interested in Buddhism in the late 70s and the early 80s, 1980s, when I was studying psychology at university, and I found my psychology studies, I was actually doing a master's degree in clinical psychology. I found them somehow inadequate in terms of addressing my own dissatisfactions or struggles with life, especially with the meaning of life. And a friend of mine had just come back from Nepal, where he'd been exposed to some of the Tibetan teachers who were beginning to teach in Nepal and moving into the West. And when I spoke to him, I was really surprised to hear that the Buddhists explore some of the issues which I'd been struggling with myself. So I began to attend some of the teachings, and the more I explored the teachings, the more interesting they became for me. So it's really since that time I've been studying the Dharma and psychology side by side.
Hmm. So as you're in school and you had actually I'm seeing from your background your work as a clinical psychologist
Yes,
for
I do.
several decades. You've been
Yes,
a student of Tibetan Buddhism. What made you decide to become ordained as a monk in, was it 2000?
yes. Well, it's to do with the sort of person I am. I'm a bit of an extreme sort of a person. So whenever I do something, I tend to like to do it to the kind of 100% degree. And with my study of the Dharma, I had been going to retreats, and I'd been kind of going in and out of the Dharma. I spend quite a few years not kind of in the Dharma so much, and when I came back to the Dharma fully, much more fully, having resolved some of my issues in the 90s, it just seemed a natural progression to see what would it be like to completely and totally embrace the teachings in the style of the Buddha himself. So I just becoming ordained seemed like a natural progression, and that's 12 years ago. I haven't really looked back from that.
Excellent. And what do you find as one of the most rewarding things about having made that transition into a monastic setting?
I should clarify that firstly, that I don't really live in a monastic setting. I don't live in a monastery, or I have lived in or stayed in monasteries in Nepal, which is my home monastery, my sort of base, where my abbot used to live. My abbot's passed on now, but so I don't really live in that kind of monastic environment. That's actually very difficult to do. Certainly in Australia, there's probably only one Tibetan monastery here, so that just does clarify that. But I do live as much as I possibly can as a monk. I keep the vows. I keep the main vows. In the Mahayana tradition, there's some flexibility about some of the other vows. The benefits of it, I suppose, are the clarity, the simplicity, the intensity of the practice, so that there's not any time off. It's 24-hour a day. You don't get any relief from living the Dharma, especially with robes and wearing the robes in around town and in my local community and where I go. The robes are kind of like as Stephen Batchelor once said. I remember him saying what he hated about the being ordained when he was ordained as a monk was that it was like screaming when you were walking around, and it's exactly like that. It's like you're on display, so you're being held accountable for what your promises are. I find that very powerful.
Mhm. Well, and it's a wonderful reminder to you of those promises and
Yeah,
keeping to them because that awareness is just that much more heightened.
precisely. That's exactly how it works.
Yeah. And I notice also as part of your background, you do a great deal of work, and as your background says, you work actively to bring a Western psychological perspective to Buddhist practice and a more spiritual dimension to psychotherapy. What are some of the most difficult aspects of that merging that you run into on a regular basis?
You mean bringing a sort of more Western perspective to Buddhism, or do you mean bringing a more sort of spiritual dimension to psychological practice?
Actually, both. Yeah, both, I'm sure, have their own set of inherent challenges.
Yeah, they do. It's been a lot easier in the last, I suppose, 15 years with the rise of the mindfulness paradigm, I suppose you could call it that, in the West. You know, the work of Kabat-Zinn and John Kabat-Zinn and people like that. That means that the Buddhism has become legitimized and far easier to talk about in Western clinical context, that's Western psychotherapeutic context, without being seen as flaky or strange or weird or some kind of new age, ungrounded ideas. It's much easier to talk about mindfulness practices and mind training practices that are drawn from the Buddhist tradition. So that's a lot easier now. In fact, I can even go fully robed to a clinical conference and present at the conference, and the organisers of the conference don't really have any problems. Of course, it's there is a bit of a feeling of, is this an attempt like a Trojan horse kind of thing that Buddhism is trying to infiltrate Western scientific discourse and trying to take it over. There is that sense that people can still be a bit skeptical. In terms of the other direction, of course, that's within Buddhism. There within Buddhist communities, there's a lot of suspicion about this process of Buddhism becoming naturalized. That's Owen Flanagan's term. I like that term, Buddhism becoming naturalized, or as some people say, Buddhism becoming diluted, Buddhism light.
Right,
Uh,
right.
there's a lot of fear about that. So I I try to talk about the Dharma as still being, even though it's sort of now got more scientific roots to it, let's say, still being grounded in the basic teachings. So trying to help people understand who in traditional Buddhist communities that it's not actually a threat at all. It's an addition.
Right. Yes, that's a wonderful way to put it, is that they can be mutually contributive to one another, and there's not an intentional agenda of subversion. There is, I think, very much so, and this surprises many traditionalists when I say that on the secular side of the equation of that contributing to an overall building of the practice and teaching and understanding of this, is that we are also very concerned about watering down. We're also very concerned about, in this way of looking at and learning and engaging with the practice, that we not lose what we find to be of value in it. So that is a shared concern about what this evolution of practice looks like as it encounters yet another cultural context, that it will in some fashion adapt, but is it going to lose something in the translation?
Yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of process. Yeah, that's a sort of, it doesn't have to happen, and it can be a synergy, exactly like you said.
Now you also had some questions for me about.
Yeah, what I was yeah, I was curious about. I used the word disenchanted, but what led you into a secular way of practicing when you've had traditional training? I think I said what how did you become disenchanted? What I actually mean is what did you find in the traditional context that was lacking for you that you wanted to practice more in a more secular way?
That is a very good question, and you're right. It isn't a disenchantment because, as I say many times on the podcast and in talks, that a secular approach is not necessarily an antagonistic commentary on tradition. Many of us who are from a more secular approach, and there are many different ways to consider a secular approach. Stephen Batchelor's way, which is, as he has termed it himself, very religious, is very different than mine. I come at it from a hard scientific background. My degree is in biology. I come from a very active skeptical community, and have participated in debates with uh, other traditionalists on the notion of God and his existence as an atheist, and how I approach that. So it wasn't so much a progress away from tradition as continuing on as I had always been, which was actively questioning and having a skeptical account of how I can distinguish between what is true in the world and what is false in the natural world. And also, and this is important to note, it's not a dichotomy. There is also things about which we simply don't know. We can't confirm or deny one way or the other. And what I've often found in discussions is that um, that's viewed as, okay, so you're agnostic about that. Like, well, yes, technically that is very true. So as we talk about the things we usually do, like rebirth, technically, yes, it is very true. My position is agnostic. But, and this is where I really need to be intellectually honest about it, is that in conversations with people in other traditions, that is typically taken as so you're halfway to being faithful, and see that as a means to convince me to be saved by Jesus. It is often how that conversation goes. And I, I have to, in all interest in maintaining integrity to my own thoughts and feelings about these things, as well as being fully honest and not hold anything back, that it's more along the lines of I'm agnostic about that in the same way that I'm agnostic about the tooth fairy. I'm happy to be convinced. I do have an open mind if I'm given sufficient, demonstrable, and unambiguous evidence. That would be great. I would like to see how that works. So in that progress of my own traditional training, and you're quite correct, that is my background from Zen and Theravada and studying with the Mahatera Bhante Gunaratna here in the United States and other Zen teachers. It's not an aversion to the religious practices. It's that I have not yet seen enough compelling, and it's not that things are not compelling. It's not really a good use of the word. They're very interesting things we see in, say, the work of Ian Stevenson that are very interesting, but they nonetheless boil down to stories, and we can't see a set of causation. And as we often say, correlation is not causation. And I do see many more, I think, reasonable explanations for some of the things that we see. And in studying the brain and how human minds work, as you do as well, it's also very easy for people to see patterns where patterns may not necessarily be there. And so I see many of those very wonderful and transformative and beneficial experiences we have, say, in meditation, that may nonetheless not be necessarily reflective of what is actually true in the world. So does that kind of get at the heart of your question?
It does, yeah. I mean, it sounds to me like you were not you didn't have an aversion for, not disenchanted with traditional practices, but you wanted to explore uh, more on you more for yourself, I suppose, how Buddhism could be fitted into a more naturalistic paradigm or more scientific paradigm.
Well, not so much making it fit into a preconceived structure of naturalism and science, but an investigation as the Buddha's ehipasiko, come and see. It's not come and believe, come and test this for yourself. And not because a religious authority says so, or because a scripture says so, or because someone 7 generations said so, but because you yourself have tried it out. And I've found it to be wonderfully beneficial. And that being wonderfully beneficial was wonderfully beneficial without adherence to an ideological point of view about what may be happening when we have, say, these experiences in meditation. So it was simply not something that needed to be added to my practice. In I'm neglecting who said the quote, but we have no need of that hypothesis is really more in keeping with my approach. And it's not that that's a bad hypothesis or even that it would be an incorrect hypothesis. It's simply that I haven't seen the need for it, at least in my own practice.
Yes, it's a kind of an interesting point that that thing about I don't have the need for that hypothesis, regarding the issue of rebirth as well, whether you have the need for the hypothesis of rebirth, or also, whether you need to have the hypothesis about the nature of the mind and its relationship with the body. That very interesting questions. I remember after about 10 years of studying the Dharma, I had a real a crisis of faith around these issues. I just couldn't take a lot of the Buddhist assumptions, like you're in the Tibetan tradition, they have a kind of a teaching about all sentient beings have been your mother, and of course it relies upon an assumption that that the stream of consciousness goes from one life to another, and so the rebirth process, and so therefore you could have, a blowfly, for example, could have been your mother in a previous life. I had a lot of trouble with that, and I struggled with it for many years. And I just looked and explored exactly like you mentioned Ian Stevenson's work on the looking at the evidence for rebirth, and it was a very fascinating journey. And at the end of the process, I had to say that to myself that I just couldn't come at it at all. I walked away from the Dharma for a while, not completely walked away from it, but explored Western philosophy and looked at that, and for quite a few years. And what I came to in that journey was that the Western philosophical look at the same issues was just didn't do it for me. It had no practice basis for it. Not only that, when I looked at the people, for examples, they were just terrible people to be around.
Yes, I completely agree with you on that, Mark, and that's what I find to be missing in much of Western, say, philosophical views or practices in therapeutic settings. And just this week in my day job life in corporate America, they had culture training for us, which was very good, and it was very similar to the Dhamma. I honestly, they were using phrases about being in the present moment. They even had a guided meditation and they didn't have the full awareness that they were doing a guided meditation. And so it was completely devoid and abstracted from that context. And I could see things that were missing from it. And what was primarily missing is what you're just referring to. We have these really great ideas. Be nice to each other. Be in the present moment. Listen sincerely to people. All that's really good stuff. But what had been lost in the translation is, okay, that's great, but as you guys are pointing out, that starts in the mind. How do you practice that? How do you develop that skill? That's what I see missing here, and that's why I remain in that a bit skeptical of how effective that's going to be in the long run without a practice behind it, without the development of that skill, as you're saying is something you found missing.
Yes, and so exactly. So I returned back to having a look at this issue, which I was stumbling with a lot, which is around rebirth, and I kind of I decided to just bracket it off as an interest, like going back to what you were saying before. I did exactly what you suggested. I said, well, I'll take it as an interesting hypothesis that could be useful And in that context, when I began to examine it as an interesting hypothesis that could be useful rather than is it true or not,
Right, right, right.
I actually discovered that in terms of my own practice, it was quite useful, even a very pragmatic sense about the fly, for example. Because if I sort of said, well, perhaps it's possible. If you actually have a look at the theory of rebirth and all that, and you look at it in terms of the mind and the possibility of consciousness being able to be transferred and coupled with the body and all that, it's least possible. It seems like very difficult to work out how it might work, and perhaps unlikely, but certainly possible. So when I examined it in that way, all of a sudden the whole issue of the fly became very interesting, because if it was possible, and perhaps there was this opportunity for a fly to be a human being in previous lives or whatever, then all of a sudden the fly in my room buzzing around became different than it was before. It seemed to be an interesting process, and I continue to have that interesting process. Actually, it's a form of Pascal's wager. That's what it
Yes,
is.
yeah, you're exactly right. And if it's true, then you're better off believing in it. Now, of course, the problem that we see with Pascal's wager is that assumes that this particular hypothesis is the correct one. And the pushback to that is, well, if that's the case, as we talk about afterlife stories, shouldn't we simply take the most horrid afterlife ideological view and avoid that one? Because if that one's true, then that's the one we've avoided, the worst possible one. So the problem with Pascal's wager is that there's the assumption, and Pascal's wager was a very much a Judeo-Christian context. And of course, the problem with that was, but what if the Buddhists are right? And that doesn't apply.
Yeah, I was going to say that before you go on, that I've actually heard lamas or read the lamas use very similar argument around the notion of continuity of consciousness through different lives. But continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, it's just the idea that I think what I have found to be very effective in that view of, let's say for the time being, whether it's true or not, setting aside our current inability to prove or disprove the veracity of that functioning in the real world, it does serve a benefit in raising our awareness and our ability to have compassion on a much broader scale than we have without that. And that taking that even as metaphor, even as just story versus reality, it still nonetheless helps support our raised awareness in a practice of compassion. And we can see in the world that is openly, demonstrably beneficial to us. So I don't see that there's a need to disprove this or prove this, because it can still contribute to what we're doing either way. And if you set me down next to another person who has the very real, visceral belief in the functioning of a life-to-life rebirth, there isn't going to be much difference, if any difference, in what we're doing in our seated meditation, in our walking meditation, in our taking this practice and awareness and compassion out into the world. So again, I can see that we have these as inspiring stories, and they can be fun and informative, and we can even take them as true if that is what is going to be most helpful to us. What we are saying is that for a lot of us, I don't have to accept that as true in order to do the practice and learn from what these ideas and views have to tell us.
No, you don't certainly have to accept it as true. The practices still stand and fall whether rebirth is true or not, definitely. Even if you just took rebirth across this life, being reborn from one moment to another, which I've heard the Dalai Lama say that, when people ask him if he can remember previous lives, he says, "My God, I can't even remember what I did yesterday. How am I going to remember the previous life?"
Yeah, and what I wonder, and this is something that I'll look to your guidance on, having taken that journey yourself in a traditional setting and then in a therapeutic setting, that yes, there was something missing. There was a paucity of practice in the therapeutic setting, in that scientific view. And I agree with that. There is. And I think that is something that can change. And I think we're seeing that change with, say, the work of John Kabat-Zinn and the MBSR and socializing that, because they do want to expand that. And when you look at what they're teaching, it is not just mindfulness. There is more context to it. There is compassion. There is that social engagement. And they do talk about that quite a lot in one of the books, Teaching Mindfulness, is one of their guides to how they approach this. And what I'm wondering is you have made a choice that no, this setting that you're in, and I mean taking on the robes, not necessarily being in a monastery, but taking on the robes,
Sure.
was the
Yep.
right decision for you. And I'm wondering what it was about the world at large that made you incline towards more on the side of accepting this as an accurate reflection of the world and using that as part of your practice, rather than simply accepting that as this is an explanation for corollaries we see in the world, and the explanation was this, and this can be a great story, and simply accepting it on that level. You've gone more towards the other side, so tell me a
Yes.
little bit about that.
Yes. Well, you see, it wasn't anything like my decision to become a monk and practice a monk, and the continuing decision, because it's not just one decision you make. You make the decision and then you get ordained. You take the promises. You have all of the ceremony and everything, but then you've got to live it day by day, and so it's a continuing process of living out what that means. It's nothing like you described. It's got nothing to do with the kind of social context or anything like that. It's what was driving me was a personal journey. The way I often describe it is when I was younger, I used to take drugs. I used to smoke a lot of marijuana and took LSD, and I was really into. I don't know if you remember Carlos Castaneda. You ever heard of Carlos Castaneda, the teachings of Don Juan, Journey to Ixtlan? It was all about using peyote, mescaline, to sort of alter your consciousness. Now that was a big part of my youth. Um, and it was like, the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac and the Dharma Bums and all that. That was a big part of being a teenager, and so when I got to Buddhism, uh, for me it was a personal journey of pushing myself to the most extreme to see what would happen if you go right to the end. And so becoming a monk is for me is like a psychedelic experience. It's psychedelic in the sense that it really sort of cuts through your traditional view of yourself and reality. And that was I really wanted to try that and see what it was like to change who I was, in the sense of how I was socially constructed. Wearing the clothes, shaving your head, having a different name, it all is very discombobulating. And on an ongoing basis, it's not just you do it and it's all over. It's happening all the time. So I wanted to see what that was like, and I found it extremely challenging, very, as I said, discombobulating. It really shifted my view of myself and my view of others, and that's why I keep doing it, because it continues to be like that. It's a personal journey. It's not about taking on some sort of socially imposed set of rules.
So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, that one of the many benefits, I imagine, to taking on robes and living the life of a monastic is that for one thing, you get to be surrounded by the practice itself, and that
Yes.
is a constant, I think, wonderful way to help with that that shaking up, that discombobulating, that dissembling of these notions of self and who we are that we have that have crystallized over the years of our lives into
Yes.
these impressions that not necessarily so, and we need to question that. And the way you're engaging with the practice, this has got to be wonderfully helpful to you in doing that shakeup.
Yes, it's very powerful, very powerful. But it has a downside. The downside is that it can be powerfully transformative. It can also be powerfully seductive. So it can do the opposite. It can especially can create some kind of aura of holiness, which is dangerous. That people start to treat you like you have some special powers, or you have some sort of special knowledge, and then become attached to it, and then it goes in the other direction. People either people meeting you in the street and asking you what's wrong with you, why are you wearing a dress, or why have you joined the Hare Krishnas, or people bowing to you in the street and wanting to make offerings to you. Either of those are just the same. They're just the same process flipped on its head.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most relevant and important messages and ideas about this practice is the no self idea, that it's not simply that we have the skandhas, we have the five heaps, and that if we look for a monolithic self, there is none to be found. It's not to say that there isn't a conventional self, that I'm not talking to you and you're not talking to me. It's not that. It's that we really don't perceive things correctly. And when we have these crystallized ideas, and not just about self in terms of you and I and me as a person, the me, myself, I, but ideas, when memes, when they become crystallized, when they get a self, that there's a risk there, because that's not always an accurate perception of things. And as you're saying, I see that kind of seeing, say, a monastic as a leader who cannot be wrong. And not just monastics, we see that in government officials, we see that in leaders of industry, and the abuses that occur because of that lack of questioning, that notion, that selfing. What are your thoughts on that? Tell me more.
Well, exactly. The use of a tie and a suit in the corporate world is exactly the same as the use of robes in the Buddhist world. It creates a certain legitimacy. It creates a certain kind of set of expectations. And the trouble is with the suit and the tie that people don't realize it's there. It just happens invisibly. People often say to me, oh, how can you walk around with those funny clothes on? And I say, well, you've got funny clothes on as well,
Yeah,
but they
ever
don't.
tried to wear a tie for 8 hours? That's crazy. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a costume we wear, and it gives an impression that is not necessarily so, and it's good for us to question those things.
Totally, and that's the danger, of course, of traditional Buddhism coming into the West. One of the big dangers is that because Buddhism by nature is cultural, let's put it that way. This is something we could also discuss, but what this is one of the of the title of my talk. One of the It was fact or fiction. The fiction bit was about the idea that some people who are interested in secular Buddhism have, that secular Buddhism is getting at real Buddhism, or
Right,
Buddhism
right,
is
right.
somehow stripped of its cultural values. Now, I'd say that's a fiction, because what I believe is that Buddhism has always been embedded in a cultural context wherever it flourishes, and secular Buddhism is as much a cultural context. It's a context of democracy. It's a context of secular democracy as much as anything else in the West. And so
Completely agree.
Buddhism is being somehow coming into the West through that lens. And that's the mistake, is to believe that this sort of Buddhism is the real one, or essential one, rather than just a new manifestation of Buddhism, which is now in the process of evolving. And it's in the process, you're just starting, really, West for the last 50 years or so, but it took 300 years for Dharma to take root and become an authentic tradition, the Chan tradition in China. So it's going to take a long time before we see what this really looks like.
Yeah, and I agree with you on this. This is an evolution, and I agree that this is also an adaptation. As we use evolution metaphors, that's very comfortable. That's home territory for me. Is that it's finding a new environment in which to flourish, that it is going to go through some changes as it does so, but it's not stripping away culture. It is changing it to another cultural context. And
Yeah,
so
that's yeah,
that's one
exactly.
of the reasons why on the site and the guiding principles, I very specifically and very intentionally, along with the other people, I like Stephen Batchelor and Stephen Scattini and some others who help articulate these ideas, is that it is specifically not something that is nailed down. Here's exactly what this is and what it's going to be, because that is going to stifle that creative exploration of what this practice may be in another cultural setting. And we don't want to set these firm boundaries that prevent or hinder or somehow break that process of it becoming a part of this different cultural context than it's found before.
Yeah, so I didn't finish what I was saying before about the danger of traditional Buddhism coming to the West, because that what I was talking about, the fiction bit, was a bit of a sidetrack. But what I wanted to point out was that when Buddhism, which is flourished in a feudal context, like say Tibetan Buddhism, and it is Tibetan society, traditional society was very, very a very sophisticated form of feudalism. And when it comes into the West with all those hierarchies and that sort of autocratic patriarchal structures, it comes to the West, then those kind of structures are hidden. Uh, this has been my experience, certainly in Tibetan Buddhism, as it's been practiced in the West. They get hidden, and people don't realize that the way they're relating to the teacher has got nothing to do with Buddhism, even though it's taught as Buddhism. It's got to do with feudalism. Therefore, the dangers become that people are not questioning enough of authority, and they're not enough aligned or in harmony with their own democratic values, which is what Australia is. And so you get these very hierarchical communities, which are using Buddhist practice as a way of replicating a feudal system in Australia, and I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, yeah, and I would agree with that. And what we see very often with people coming at this from a more with being raised in a democratic society, that you're right. A lot of that is hidden. We don't even realize it. We assume that either it's okay, this is a teacher, and that paradigm is a good and appropriate one, and it's fine, and we don't question. And you're right. I think we need to question. The phrase I use is question with confidence. It's okay to
Mm.
question. We should encourage that. But that, in addition, what we see is now, as we find, say, Tibetan Buddhism finding its way into the West, and there is that feudal mentality and that mindset coming with it from many of the teachers that have come to the West. How do we merge, adapt, change, question that kind of thing when it is encountering a more democratic constituency? What are ways in which we can help that grow?
Yeah, that's the challenge. What are the ways? And that I'm very excited and passionate about finding those ways, because I'm located within the Tibetan tradition, and I think it's got an enormous amount to offer, and there is this problem and challenge with how you do question the authority of the teachers. Especially, you can see in Tibetan tradition that the sexual scandals and the financial scandals, those things are coming about because people are giving up their skepticism and giving up their willingness to question when they see that things are not really congruent with the teachings.
Yeah.
So we need to have conversations with the communities of people and encourage people to bring the democratic traditions which we all love so much into our Dharma centres.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're seeing a great deal of progress along those lines, and certainly a long way to go. It's an unfortunate fact that we have seen that things happen, abuses of power occur, and then there is a process of creating mechanisms to prevent that kind of thing, where really what would be very helpful for us is to formulate something to help with that. Take some of the existing policies and practices of some of the centers that have gone through this, that have developed something to really help with that, and use them at the outset, use them at the beginning of the creation of a new center to help derail those bad behaviors from occurring before they occur. And it's not going to be perfect. We're going to see problems. Anytime there's a disparity in perception of power and decision making, the greater that is, the greater is that opportunity for abuse. And Scott Edelstein's book, Sex and the Spiritual Teacher, really goes into that and looks at some of the cases and what has occurred out of them and how that can change. Is there pushback from a more traditional community against having that kind of transparency and including that kind of awareness of these issues?
I can't really answer that because I'm not really involved in the traditional community.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty much I don't know how to put it, doing my own thing, I suppose, even though I'm very connected still to the Tibetan tradition. Certainly in Australia, the traditional Tibetan communities are quite closed, a bit cult-like, I'd have to say. And so that makes it difficult for those communities to engage in conversation with people who have a broader view of Dharma. It's not, it's not exclusive, but it is difficult because those traditional structures are very rigid and they're not open to questioning so much. But I think that, I do think that is changing. Like even what we're talking about now, this conversation about secular Buddhism and people being interested in practicing from a more secular position and also not even practicing as Buddhists. The community of people that I'm mostly involved here in Melbourne, a lot of the people who come are not even Buddhists. They come along to do practice together, and we have conversations with Christian contemplatives and Islamic contemplatives less, but we're still from the Sufi tradition. So it's a kind of like a pluralistic community of people who are all interested in the contemplative life from different points of view, and I find that very very encouraging.
Yeah, as do I. And two of the reasons I find that encouraging is, first, to me, that bespeaks of the veracity of this practice being for everyone, that you don't have to become a Buddhist to do this and to find some benefit from it. I'm also encouraged to this. The second reason is because this is a very inclusive mindset, that we want to share this with others and see that have a positive impact in their lives. So I also find that encouraging. It's one of the reasons that I continue to do interfaith dialogues, even though I'm the token Buddhist on the panel and have sometimes a very different perspective than some of my fellow panelists. And they are aware I am also an atheist. that's okay. We can still find common ground upon which to build better experiences in life.
Yeah, I think that's one of the arguments why the whole Buddhism light, or the Buddhism diluted argument that a lot of more traditional teachers are worried about, that when they talk about secular Buddhism, or they talk about the way that Dharma is being practiced, say within psychological communities, the worry is that the Dharma is going to be diluted out, that the baby's going to be thrown out with the bathwater, like we said before. And I think the counter argument to that is that there's a lot of people who are interested in contemplative life, and they don't want to become Buddhist or Christian or anything. They just want to learn practices which will increase eudaimonia, or increase their genuine happiness. And so of those people who meet meditation and compassion practices, of those people, many of them will go on and take a journey into Buddhism, and maybe even become Buddhists themselves, like I myself have done and other people have done. But all the people who don't, it doesn't mean that they're not still worthy of having effective practices, being introduced to effective practices. So the idea is, the Buddha never wanted to spread Buddhism. He wanted to spread happiness, and that's, genuine happiness, relief from suffering. That's more important than the spread of Buddhism. Of course, from the other side, the more traditional teachers, I really understand where they're coming from. These are people who have been thrown out of their own country by the Chinese, and they're wanting to preserve something of the lifestyle, something of the Dharma that they were practicing. So they're in preservation mode, but they're in a different place than me. I wasn't born in Tibet.
Right, right. And that's where many secular Buddhists, I to use that term, come from and adhere to this practice and are really interested in this, is that they're not from that setting. And so that interest in having a preservation of their culture is not how we're engaging with it as, say, Americans coming to the practice. That my culture is one of diversity and variety and change, and so that is the way in which I'm engaging with it. That is my cultural context, and I really can't strip it away from that.
Yeah, so because we're not in preservation mode as many more traditional teachers are, especially the Tibetans, but not just the Tibetans, I suppose. Um, we are coming at it from a completely different angle. But I should say, the other thing I wanted to say about this is that I still really benefit from the debates. Let's take the debates that are occurring between, let's say, traditional teachers and, for want of a better word, the secular Buddhists.
Yep.
I still really benefit from both sides of the debate. Let's take one example, which you yourself are actively involved in, the debate about whether karma and rebirth are necessary for a Buddhist practice. And Stephen Batchelor's produced his recent book, Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, and then Alan Wallace has produced his recent book, which is Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic. And that debate between the two of them, and that Alan gave a kind of scathing critique of Stephen's book, and then Stephen replied, and then on your website you've got a blow-by-blow account of Alan Wallace's critique. I find that whole process really exciting. I get a lot out of reading both Stephen's book and Alan's book, and Alan's critique and Stephen's reply and your reply to Stephen's reply, and then my thoughts about what you said. I find that really enriching. It really deepens my understanding of some of these really difficult issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that robust debate, despite criticisms you can make about the form of the debate, whether people's arguments are rigorous and well thought through, or whether they're being fair, regardless of all that, I think that's a very, very healthy process, and one that I love to remain involved in.
Yeah, I do as well, and thank you for saying that because the thing that I want to make sure that people come away with understanding of this is that having a healthy dialogue is not a bad thing, and that we can disagree because we have different backgrounds. We have different weights to what we resonate with most, and so we may reach different conclusions. That's not a bad thing. We call that diversity. Diversity is a really terrific asset when you talk about the evolution of a practice, of an understanding, of an awareness. And Alan has had really wonderful things to contribute to this. And I have his book right here, and his criticisms of Stephen's work have points that are perfectly valid from his perspective, and our criticisms are also valid from our perspective. And these are not statements about um, winning a fight. These are sharing different ideas, and people will find things in them that attract them. And so folks who are more inclined towards a traditional kind of practice will resonate with that, and they will find it, and they will do it, and it will help them. And people who resonate with a more secular practice will resonate with that, and they will do it, and it will help them. That's okay. That's the strength of diversity.
Yeah, and the robustness of that debate is also quite exciting too, to watch spirited defenses of different ideas and positions, and then counter arguments. It helps one enormously to clarify one's own understanding. This Alan has been very trenchant in his criticism of scientific materialism, of course,
Yep.
and um, and that comes down to the whole. It's very relevant in terms of the core issue of the mind and consciousness and the nature of consciousness. And I've spoken to Stephen about his what I feel is kind of falling, not falling as in badly, but his conclusion, a sort of materialistic conclusion. Like how did he come to that? And he kind of put me on a few books which I read, and I still have a struggle to see. I must admit, like how, and I know you said you were an avowed a materialist, so I still struggle to see how you kind of come to that conclusion, given the philosophy, the sort of deep philosophical issues around the mind-body problem, and the fact that they certainly haven't been solved in the Western philosophical tradition. There are kind of deep debates on both sides. I can't quite see how, from a skeptical point of view, you can sort of be an avowed materialist. That I'm interested in how you get there.
That is an excellent question. I'd be happy to chat about that for a few minutes. When we say avowed materialist, we say it in the same way that I am an atheist with regards to the tooth fairy. If I am given a compelling and unambiguous set of evidence and data points that strongly indicate a particular truth about the world, then I am happy to change my mind. That is the nature of open-mindedness. What I'm challenged by is, as I said, of course, Pascal's wager. You need to do this because it might be true. The problem with that is, of course, one could fit any kind of explanation and say, well, that might be true. Well, the Mormons have that argument. The Jehovah's Witnesses have that argument. Everyone has that kind of argument. So the only way I can discern what might be the real one, why is it that I know Thor might not actually be causing the thunder and the lightning, is by continuing to question. And if we say, it is this hypothesis, which is the true one, and you need to adhere to that, then I've stopped questioning. Then I've stopped looking for answers that I can go into and check and maybe verify and maybe learn. And that we don't know everything because we don't, barely scratching the surface, absolutely. The God of the Gaps argument, my friend Matt Lowry coined the phrase the Buddha of the Gaps argument. To say that science hasn't shown XYZ yet is very true, but it also doesn't mean that, therefore, an explanation which might not have evidence must be true. That's not the case either. So the question is, what do we know? What can we show? And if we can't show something, it's not that we won't be able to at some point, and when we can, that's wonderful, that's great, that's how we learn. We need to keep investigating that kind of thing. But until we do, we have a lot of interesting ideas, and they can help us as people, and they can contribute to our practice, as you said, with the ideas of rebirth. And we don't have to take them as literal truths, or we can. They'll still help us. But to say, you're denying that my particular hypothesis is true because you're being a materialist, and, well, that's denialism. Like, denialism of what? Give me your evidence. Convince me. I'm happy to be convinced. Where I go with materialism is it's because it's the one way that has shown the best way for us to determine provisionally what's true from what is false. If there's another way that doesn't involve us checking anything in the natural world, I'd wonder what that is, because I don't exist outside of the natural world. And if I do, how do I know it? Because anything that shows it would have to have a natural corollary. So that's where I'm left with, if it's something outside of the natural world, how do I know it, is my question back.
Yes. I suppose, it's sort of like you become a materialist because you don't have any other more powerful argument.
Well, it's not that I've become a materialist, it's that I've always been a materialist, and nothing has been presented that's a better way of indicating what is true or false.
That's a bit like saying, the prevalent paradigm is the one of scientific materialism. So you've been inculcated by the prevalent paradigm, so you haven't met anything that somehow challenges it anyway.
Yes, you could say that, if not for what is built into that paradigm, and having gone through and gotten a degree in the sciences, is that constant adherence to the idea that we need to show what our assertions are. Not just make the assertions, but show why they are so. And in science, and this is one of the criticisms I hear quite often, is scientists, in fact, Alan makes this case, is that scientists are not skeptical enough because as you're saying, they're accepting this paradigm that science is the best way to lead us to truth.
No, scientific materialism is the best way.
Scientific materialism is the best way to lead us to truth. And the only thing I would ask about that is, what do you have that's better, that has a better track record of ascertaining what is provisionally true in the world? I'm happy to be convinced, but what is it? Tea leaves? Is it palm reading? Is it? I don't. What I get is, I don't get anything that I can check for myself, and that's the problem that I have.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that I don't find that persuasive myself, because it's sort of like, given that the dominant paradigm, the one that you're talking about, is based on, only studying material stuff rather than studying the mind itself. It sort of becomes like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy for me. Where I come from on the issue, I don't have any problems, by the way, with everything you said. I can see it. I just can't go the extra step, which is the extra step of embracing a materialistic explanation. When I read, this has got nothing to do with Buddhism around this issue, but when I read, let's say, Daniel Dennett's book on Consciousness Explained.
Yep, got it right here.
Yeah, I read Daniel Dennett's book, which is the kind of the most sophisticated, sort of deepest materialist explanation of consciousness. I end up with the conclusion, which I read in a review of somebody, it's like consciousness explained away. He explains the phenomena away completely. So then, when I come to David Chalmers' book, I don't know if you're conscious experience is his, and he's critiquing from a completely, totally Western philosophical position, got nothing to do with Buddhism in it at all. But he's critiquing the materialist position of Dennett and other Patricia Churchland and others, and I must admit I find it hard to resist his arguments. It seems like the kind of the primacy of experience and how you understand and explain that is something that needs explaining. And so then when I begin to explore, these issues, these really deep issues about the mind-body problem, for example, how the mind relates to the body, uh, I'm never satisfied with the materialist explanation. It always seems to be a very sophisticated kind of attempt to just come back to materialism. So that's just my own journey. That's why I can't take the kind of the extra step, which is what an avowed materialist takes. I've been reading a book by Evan Thompson. I don't know if you're familiar with Francesco Varela and Evan Thompson's The Embodied Mind and their work. And Evan Thompson's just produced Mind and Life, which is a kind of a encyclopedic examination of phenomenology, I suppose, the phenomenology of the mind. And again, it's a very sophisticated argument for how the mind-body problem might be solved, but it's not using a materialist explanation. And so therefore I'm not convinced.
Which is fine. Then the question I would have is, how would we how would we ascertain the veracity of those statements? Setting aside using a materialistic standpoint, how would we check? How would we know?
It's got to be completely unutterably first person. You can't be using brain scans and all that because, again, exactly like you said before, it falls into the same thing that correlation is not causation. Uh, so it's got to be unutterably first person. My my sort of journey, I suppose, I'm in my 50s now, so I sort of think I've got probably hopefully another maybe 30 years. In that time, I would hope to refine the tool of my own consciousness, my own awareness, to explore the nature of consciousness completely first person and see what I might discover then. Experiment on one person, my own self. Uh, that seems to be the direction the Buddha took, and certainly he's left guidelines, for the practice and the dangers of the practice and how you can refine your own attention uh, to the point of being able to really look into consciousness from a first person point of view and see what you discover. I don't think that in and of itself is going to be enough. I think it has to be correlated as well with other practitioners' experience. So it's got to be grounded as well in a community, that's sort of not just your own trip, so to
Yeah,
speak,
yeah.
but is validated by others. I think that's possible, but that's where I'm going to go with it.
You bring up a very good point, and one that I agree with, is that these are personal journeys. These are personal experiences. And one of the things we don't have today, and I am very skeptical that we would ever have this, is you know jack someone's brain into a computer and you see their experiences. That we actually can experience what another person is. Even if we could do that, it's their experience. It's not ours. Just a difference there that changes the entire thing. So I agree with you about that. And I would suggest that one of the challenges that I face with my own acceptance of some of the experiences we have, say, in meditation, is that there is an understanding and things that we can do to replicate scientifically, whether through the out of body machine, for example, that reproduces these effects. is that our experiences, however compelling they may be, are not necessarily accurate about what has actually happened. Sue Blackmore retells her story about her out-of-body experience and journey around town, and then checking it the next day found that most of it was completely inaccurate. And we have the out-of-body experience of someone in a hospital and seeing a tennis shoe that couldn't be seen by anyone. There's no way they could possibly have known. When actually they check, why, yes, it was very clearly visible to anyone coming in the hospital. So that just plain wasn't true. It was an assumption about the circumstances of these events. Reading Thomas Metzinger's Ego Tunnel, or several of the books of Richard Wiseman, 59 Seconds, one of his books, or Quirkology. Our brains are not recorders. Our minds are not always giving us an accurate reflection of reality, that there's a perception through the sense doors of what's going on externally that's not us, that we're embedded in this environment, but that we're getting this through sense doors, and our minds are creating impressions that may not necessarily be accurate. And Metzinger's book in particular goes into a number of the things like the rubber hand experiments and NDEs, and all of that sort of thing. So I see how quite easily the mind is fooled. And as we talk with, say, Elizabeth Loftus, who was on NPR just this past week, on repressed memories of sexual abuse, and how memories they don't work that way, that we can create false memories quite easily.
Well, in fact, all memories are false in some sense.
Yeah, and so as I look at all of that, I see that my experiences, again, it's how we take these things. What can we learn from them that's of benefit? I see that there's a sufficient and repeatable and unambiguous and demonstrable body of evidence that my brain is not perfect. I'm not perfect. What I think of as me is not so. That's okay. What do I get out of the experiences that I have that can help me lead a better life, make better decisions, be more loving to those in my life? To me, that's what's very important, rather than, this is fake, this is true.
Yes. You know what, Ted? I kind of lost the point.
Well,
You were saying that for a point, but I kind of lost what the point you were making. It had something to do with what I was saying about, going on that experiment of my, examining my own experience.
Yes.
to
I am a
sort of
materialist. And the materialist point of view, why reach that conclusion versus any other, is that is what has proven itself to be through repeated testing. And remember, in science, you get a great deal of profs for disproving well-held theories and ideas, as you do for making them, is that it does get continually looked at, and that the scientific method of questioning and demonstrating has been very helpful to me in my practice. And I see that to be much more contributive and effective as I try to ascertain, hey, I had this experience in my meditation where I thought I was so-and-so in a past life. You know what? That if I believe in that as a true reflection of the real world, there's a much greater risk of me getting attached to that past life and what it means, and my stress about how I'm in the place I am, rather than being contributive. It's actually hurting my practice.
Yeah, it's very clear that if you're going to do what I was describing, which is, extended retreat, really fine-tuning your attention, that you wouldn't want to just go off on your own without some kind of tools of verification for your experience. I think that's absolutely true. Otherwise, having done retreat myself, without some kind of guide, and it's not just, a guide in terms of previous people who've done the similar practice and know the traps. Also, a guide in terms of talking to somebody, you can get lost.
Absolutely. Yeah,
In
absolutely.
all the figments of your imagination, whether it be past lives or God knows what, that come up and distract you from the real task. That's absolutely true. I suppose what I'm saying is I believe it's possible. I believe it's possible to have those systems of verification in place. Of course, I don't think we have them yet, but I think they could be evolved, definitely. And, even in the Buddhist time before the rise of the scientific revolution, they had systems in place for making sure that people didn't get lost in the figment of their own imagination.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think what we're both saying is that it's going to be an interesting next few hundred years.
Yeah, I think it's actually going to be, because the pace of change and the pace of the process is quite rapid. If I look at what's been happening in the last even 10 years, it's been phenomenal. The growth of interest in mind training techniques and practices, and of course we know it's come about because those mind training practices and techniques have been applied to evidence systems. We know that's why it's happened. John Kabat-Zinn is not famous because he's interested in Buddhism. He's famous because he managed to take some techniques and practices from the Buddhist tradition and demonstrate using evidence-based techniques that they were effective. That's why he's famous.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that kind of being able to have that ability to point to, here's how we know. Here's how we have that. Again, provisionally, knowing is never set in stone. It's always subject to being updated based on new information. That's tremendously valuable in and powerful in carrying this outside of the bounds of the settings in which our practice has been historically, which is in the Buddhist. You will be a Buddhist as a Buddhist culture or a Buddhist country or Buddhist practice, and that's how you hear it. And in particular, with the advent of things like social networking and the digital age, the communication of these ideas is now geographically dispersed. We're not limited to a particular teacher at a particular monastery talking to a limited number of people who then may not be world constant travelers sharing it with a couple of people. Now we have examples of, say, this podcast and this conversation going out to 1,500 people in the first week or two at this time is the current rate, and always being available for people to look back and say, how did that conversation go with TL and with Ted when they were talking about this stuff and some of the challenges that are faced and some of the mutual contributions that are occurring between these different realms of Buddhism in the West and what they're finding? How did that's always available. So I think you're right. The rate of propagation of these ideas is going to continue, and I think we'll see it permeating the culture in a much more rapid fashion than, say, it took Zen to permeate China or Japan or any new environment of which it's been on. We're global, and information is available always and much more quickly now.
Yeah. So that's all true. I mean, we're having this conversation how many thousands of kilometers apart?
Yeah.
Which is kind of very strange, isn't it? That I'm over here in Australia, right down on the southern tip of Australia, and you're smack bang in the middle of America.
Yeah. And how wonderful. Wonderful that we can share. That's one of the things I find most exciting about this time that we're in right now is the unprecedented opportunity we have. And here's the fill in the blank part, and this is the choice that we all get to make every moment, to build or to take down. And I want this to be building, and it's one of the reasons why I try to be very encouraging to folks on the site that we do have positive engagement, that we not go into getting to a place of disagreeing about something, as you and I will do, and that's okay. We're still encouraging one another in what we're doing because we see the value of it and don't have to go to uh, one another feels this way and we look because we didn't gain agreement, we look towards therefore there must be some problem with the person. There isn't. These are different perspectives, and that's all right.
It is going to happen that in exchanges of opinions, especially where there's some disagreement and there's some passion, that it's sometimes going to get a bit difficult, uncomfortable. Like you, to go back to what we were describing before, the exchange between Stephen Batchelor and Alan Wallace. When you read that exchange, I felt uncomfortable because it seemed like it was like a fight almost. So I think that's going to happen. And the idea, I believe, is to be monitoring one's own emotional engagement with the process and try to keep it as as harmless and as good spirited as we can. That's the idea. Um,
Yes. Yeah, and that's the practice itself, and this is why again I do call myself a secular Buddhist, is that the practice is a wonderful guide to me. It calls me on my bad behaviors, my bad words, and I'm not perfect. I will stumble. I will falter.
yep.
And it's what I do from that moment and the wonderful understanding that as I conclude every podcast in the final bit of the recording and during the music is every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can.
Yeah, yeah. Whether you're going to enact the qualities which are inspiring or fall away from them.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So you were saying Ted before why you are a secular Buddhist, and I just wanted to make a few comments about why I'm not.
Yeah, please do. Yes, please.
Yeah. One of the reasons I wouldn't call myself a secular Buddhist, even though I have to say that most of the people in the kind of communities in which I move are, is because I still find these cultural practices which I've learned, from 12 years of intense study in of Tibetan Buddhism. I still find the cultural practices really engaging and enlivening and inspiring. For example, a lot of the ritual practices, like bowing, I find that the bowing is a very powerful physical action, sort of very experiential, and and the chanting and the all the iconography. I find it really useful. So I have tankas and statues and
I do
um,
too, actually.
yeah. So I think those parts, the rituals, um, are really come out of cultural traditions, and it's still not to say that there can't be rituals in secular Buddhist practice, but I think it's a bit early to say what those rituals might be. I don't know if you're familiar with Alain de Botton's book, Religion for Atheists.
Yeah, I am. In fact, my roommate has a copy of it. Yes.
Yeah, it's great because it talks about the sort of baby thing, the baby out bathwater that you actually, if you're a secular Buddhist, you chuck out all ritual because you don't like it, it makes you uncomfortable. And what Alain de Botton is saying is that is going to be a loss, could be potentially a loss, especially in the area of ritual and the creation of community and incenting. Um, those sort of things I still very much take from the Buddhist tradition, which I'm most familiar with. So I still consider myself to be a Tibetan Buddhist. And with which we discussed the nature of consciousness. I still have to say that I find rebirth an interesting hypothesis, which is useful to me. Not a hypothesis, but as we were discussing before. Philosophically, I find the idea of materialism I just doesn't make logical sense to me. So in that sense, I'm not a secular Buddhist either. But what do you think a secular Buddhist is? What criteria? That's a good question, isn't it?
I think that's an excellent question, and that's come up several times. So I actually do have an answer to that. One of the things I would like to say is that notion that if you're a secular Buddhist, you don't do ritual. And that's not true, actually. When I sit, I light incense every time. And I do that as a reminder to me of what my practice is about. And that's to me, a perfectly naturalistic thing. It helps set the tone of my sitting. It helps set the tone of my mind. What I would say a secular Buddhist is someone who is examining what this practice may be within their own cultural context outside of a traditional setting. And some folks who, from the speculative non-Buddhism side, have suggested that as one way of looking at it. I tend to view it as more the common thread that secular practitioners seem to have is approaching the Dhamma from a naturalistic point of view. And that doesn't mean you have to say rebirth is false because there's no hard evidence and we don't have a study that went through. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we can find a very rich and vibrant and contributive and valid practice without having to have a dependency on the supernatural for it to provide value to our lives. And one might have it as one might have a very religious kind of approach to this. Stephen does. He has called his practice religious. And from retreats, when you see him walking in and bowing and his approach to it, it does strike one as very religious. I still do bow and I do full prostrations to the monks out of a respect for who they are in their tradition. And that's a reflection of my respect of who they are and their culture, but it is not a dependence on supernatural ideas. And I don't see those as necessary. And it seems that most folks who will identify as secular Buddhism will say, well, they'll have varying degrees of their use of ritual. They'll have different opinions on, say, the hierarchical distinctions of our traditional settings and some of the risks and benefits to that sort of thing. Where we seem to have a common idea is this natural world approach to Buddhist practice. And again, as you said earlier, that's part of our cultural reflection and its adaptation to where we are now. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so I mean, in short, you'd say that secular Buddhism is a style of Buddhism which is not relying at all on any supernatural content.
Yeah, there's no dependency on it. Yeah, that's how.
Yeah.
Yep.
And could you say the other aspect? Could you say would be evidence-based Buddhism? A sort of Buddhism which is also relying on evidence for its truth claims.
I'm not sure that I would use the word evidence, and one reason I'm a bit hesitant to use that is that evidence in, say, the medical community
Yes.
often leads us to incorrect conclusion, as does just reasoning.
Yes.
That
Precisely.
evidence-based, I would say, is there's a risk there to just say evidence-based, and so I'm not willing to quite take that step. The idea that it be something we be able to show to one another, we're not always going to be able to do that with our experiences. That's not something that we have to do to still find them of positive benefit to our lives. What I am saying is that conclusions that we reach, again, provisional conclusions about these, would typically be based in a natural worldview. But evidence-based is kind of a risk because evidence can be misread, it can be misinterpreted, we can have bad controls over the evidence that gets presented. So I wouldn't say necessarily evidence-based.
Sure, that's a critique of, what is good evidence, what is bad evidence, etc. But wouldn't you agree, or would you say that the notion of verifiability is important?
I would say it may be helpful, but I will never be able to verify your personal experience in meditation. So I would say that verifiability itself is not something I would without any reservation accept as a part of secular Buddhism.
Okay, it's interesting because, yeah, that's very interesting because from all the comments you were making before, I had that feeling that the sort of verifiability is really important to you, the way you're describing, the materialism issue.
Yeah, where we get into that slippery slope and why several people right now I can feel they're shaking their fists at me and saying no, 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 you have to say verifiability, is that we're not talking about the rate of a falling object in a vacuum. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about personal experience. And that's not something that I, people say, well, I had this experience in my meditation where it was an out of body thing. Okay, you had an experience. There's no denying that. There's no way I can confirm or deny that you had an experience. So I have to set aside that evidence part. Now, when you say, in my experience, I floated over the building, and here's the kind of roofing we have, that is subject to verification because that may or may not be true. And if it's accurate, that doesn't necessarily mean that you perceived it because of your out of body experience. You saw my roof when you were driving up to my house. So there are assertions we make about the natural world. I would suggest those are things we would want to look at to see how we may verify them. But that I don't want us to get lost in the area of remembering that this is about one's personal experience and how you moment by moment live your life. And that's not something that is subject to verification.
Oh, gee, I can feel a kind of contradiction coming on here, Ted, because it seems to me that you're saying that the Buddhism naturalized. That means that the mind and one's experience must be a natural phenomena. So if it's a natural phenomena, it must be open to some form of verification, even if the form is going to be not exactly the same as say verifying a falling apple or whatever. It still does seem to me that the verification issue is important. Am I getting something wrong here?
No, I think part of it is the slippery slope, and the reason I'm not firmly adhering to we must have evidence for everything we do as experiences within our own mind. And those aren't necessarily things that are about the external world, they're about how we feel, for example. We don't, of course, we're in the fetal stage of seeing what's going on in the mind, and we're learning about that. So what I don't want to have is, well, because the guy who does this podcast says we need to have evidence for everything we do, and we don't have it. Therefore, they're wrong, and therefore, our religious view is correct. I'm not going to do that.
Okay, yeah, that's a kind of looking for right and wrong. That's what you're worried about. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, that's very dangerous too. I agree.
Yeah, and it's not to say that verification about assertions in the natural world, those are things we can look at, but we need to be realistic about what we could verify and whether there's any value in verifying, I was sitting for 20 minutes and we've done some studies so we know it's the process of meditation and not simply going on vacation or being told a story versus a guided meditation, but it's the actual meditation process itself. Let's say we've progressed in our studies on that it made you happy. That's where we need to get to. So it's not for me to say you must like milk chocolate because I do. You must not like dark chocolate because I don't. That's personal. There's no verification we need to do around that. I'm never going to have the same experience with someone who likes dark chocolate as much as I like milk chocolate.
There will be some things. I'm thinking of a kind of chestnut of debate is the issue of the substrate consciousness,
Yeah, yeah.
which there will be some things which maybe only be kind of findable via first person methodologies, meaning one's own process of meditation. And it does seem important that those processes, that phenomena, let's say, the substrate consciousness or the existence or not of it, or how it exists, that does seem important, that in some sense we need to find a method for verification regarding that sort of stuff.
Yes, exactly. And again, happy to be convinced. I would love to see that. That would be very, very cool. To frankly put a common word on it, that would be cool.
You wouldn't see it, you would experience it. Because if you were seeing it, it wouldn't be the substrate consciousness, it would be visual consciousness.
Right. And so that's the question is, okay, so how do we demonstrate? The fact is we can call it substrate consciousness, but the problem I have is, well, we could call it something else too. How do we distinguish between those? How do we distinguish between what constitutes the baby we're throwing out? That's what how do we determine that?
Exactly. So there you can see immediately leaps in the verifiability issue.
Yeah.
So it is there somewhere, but the danger is, of course, that it turns into right and wrong, which is completely useless.
Exactly. Yes, totally with you.
Yep.
Anything else you wanted to chat about before we conclude today?
No, I think that's been a very rich and varied discussion. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you very much, Ted, for inviting me.
Thank you very much. And our guest today, again, for folks listening, is Thupten Lekshe, or TL. I did want to give the web address for folks listening of www.yulolling.com. TL, thank you very much for being here.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.